Appeals to ethos are again about communicating the speaker's own credibility to the hearers, engendering trust on the part of the hearers so that they will be receptive to whatever advice the speaker is seeking to give or to the case that the speaker is trying to make. Credibility is thought of in these rhetorical handbooks in terms of goodwill toward the audience, in terms of expertise or authority in regard to a particular matter, and also in regards to the speaker's virtue. Is he or she a good person, someone trustworthy based on his or her moral character? We would investigate appeals to ethos where we look for ways in which a text is seeking to communicate any of these three elements. How does a speaker show his goodwill or her goodwill toward the audience? The esteem in which he or she holds them, the good that he or she wants for them. How does a speaker demonstrate expertise? How does he communicate, without bragging about it, that he or she really knows what he or she is talking about in regard to this particular matter? And of course, how does the speaker show himself or herself to be committed to the highest ideals, so that to follow such a speaker is to go reliably in the direction of those high ideals oneself? And of course, as we've already seen in the last segment, appeals to ethos also have to do with undermining the credibility of opposing speakers in regards to all these elements as well. One often finds appeals to ethos most at the beginning and the end of a communication. Whether or not we speak of these in terms of exordia and perorations, the openings and closings of communications are generally the places where a speaker must establish ethos, particularly the exordium, and toward the end, especially for leaving the audience well-disposed toward that speaker and ill-disposed toward other people who might be speaking to that same audience. We notice this, for example, in Galatians. Paul is very heavily invested in the opening of the speech in reaffirming his authority and credibility and the reasons for that. And at the end of the speech, he invests a fair amount, yes, in his own reliability, in his own trustworthiness, but also in the lack of reliability on his opponent's parts, as he ascribes some self-serving and base motives behind their work in Galatia. And of course, the rhetorical theorists advise that one has to be attentive to ethos throughout one's speech. There will be many occasions on which it is strategic, even necessary, to reestablish that sense of goodwill between speaker and audience, or that sense of credibility. In regard to Hebrews, we could find the author using appeals to ethos, kind of constructing ethos in a number of ways, in a number of places. Of course, the beginning is an important place to look for this, and the opening sentence of Hebrews itself communicates the author's expertise in homiletics, in public speaking. It's a beautifully crafted sentence, full of rhetorical ornament, and while it says some important things about the Son, it also says some important things about the speaker, rendering the hearers attentive and receptive. The flurry of Old Testament references that follows then in 1:5-14 again says a lot about the Son and Jesus' place in the cosmos, but it also says a lot about the speaker, communicating to the hearers his expertise in the sacred oracles of God, both in terms of knowing them backward and forward, and being able to interpret them expertly. This, again, continues to render the hearers attentive and receptive to what the preacher has to say to them. One could go on throughout the text of Hebrews thinking in these terms, looking for these places where ethos is reinforced. 5:11 to 14 is a rather obvious place because the speaker breaks off his discourse to address the audience afresh and in a surprising way, kind of giving them a slap upside the head, as it were, to get their attention about 15 minutes into the sermon, because he's about to challenge them, given the circumstances in which they find themselves, or more particularly, the way that some of them have begun to respond to those circumstances. And we find him being attentive then on the other side of this harsher moment in the sermon, in 6:9 to 12, reestablishing connection. In case he has alienated the hearers by coming down on them too hard, he takes pains in this paragraph to reassure the audience of his own goodwill toward them, his confidence in them, that really they will continue to be virtuous and to act in such a way as will allow them to remain in God's favor to the end. We've seen that appeals to pathos have to do with arousing strategic emotions in the audience. It is important for us to be aware that pathos is not about the speaker's emotions, except insofar as the speaker's emotiveness contributes to arousing emotions in the hearers, which might be the same or even reciprocal. So appeals to pathos are not just about seeing where the speaker is getting emotional, but thinking about how the speaker is trying to make the hearers experience a particular emotion and why, to what end. Again, the first half of the second book of Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric is probably the best resource for thinking about how classical orators, how orators in the Greek, Hellenistic, and Roman periods would push buttons to arouse particular emotions. Now I give a rather close attention to ways in which the author of Hebrews evokes particular emotions in one of the readings that I've prescribed for this module. The exegetical skills segment on rhetorical criticism appeals to the emotions found in the chapter on Hebrews in my New Testament introduction. So I would refer you there especially to pages 784 to 86 for material on the specific emotions that the author of Hebrews seems to be evoking, how he does so, and to what end he does so. Appeals to rational argumentation are of two basic kinds, inductive and deductive. Students of rhetoric were trained from the very elementary exercises from their middle school educational experience in developing both kinds of proof and learning how to use the two of them together to persuade their hearers. Deductive proofs are those marked by syllogistic reasoning. A full syllogism is an attempt, is a basic tool of logic, to derive a reliable conclusion from reliable premises. One often finds two premises, sometimes more, but in the most rudimentary form, two premises leading to a conclusion. One tending to be a general rule that holds true, a second one that is a more specific instance that allows for the application of the general to a particular person, circumstance, or topic, and then a conclusion that is derived as the full meaning of the major premise is mapped onto the specifics of the minor premise. The example I give in the introduction to Perseverance in Gratitude follows this pattern. The major premise is that all patrons deserve gratitude. This would in fact be a truism in the ancient world. No one would object to that as a reliable premise on which arguments can be based. One might then apply this, or seek to apply this, to a specific or particular instance. Erastus has benefited our city. So this is the step in which a particular patron, Erastus, is brought into view as the elements of the major premise, all patrons deserve gratitude, begin to be mapped onto the specific. Erastus is identified as a patron. The conclusion, therefore, could be, therefore, Erastus deserves civic gratitude. This is the mapping of the second element of the major premise onto the particular case, and completes our syllogism. Very often we find less pedantic versions of syllogisms in actual orations and actual texts. In fact, these reduced syllogisms are encouraged by rhetoricians such as Aristotle, because one doesn't have to weary one's hearers with stuff that they would themselves assume and be able to supply. So one finds a lot of discussion in rhetorical handbooks of enthymemes, which Aristotle describes as reduced syllogisms, where one premise goes unexpressed because it can be assumed. The audience can be expected to supply it naturally. And in fact, this is quite strategic because an enthymeme invites the audience to participate in its own persuasion. So let's go back to our example. An enthymeme would simply be, Erastus deserves our gratitude because he has benefited our city. That enthymeme presents a conclusion and one rationale, which in this case happens to be the minor premise of a syllogism. What is not said here is that all patrons deserve gratitude. So if you belong to class A, the patron class, you merit action B, the reception of gratitude. But everyone knows this, so why say it? One can have a less pedantic presentation that way. And again, invite the audience to think with you as the speaker, supplying these missing premises. This is an important thing to keep in mind when we're unpacking argumentation in New Testament texts, because very often we find enthymemes rather than syllogisms, and we are invited by this to think together with the writer, whichever author it happens to be. What is this writer assuming that the hearers will supply as true in order for them to go along with his logic, with his reduced syllogism? And this gets us into kind of the unspoken, but assumed, very much present, very much active knowledge that comes along with the Roman-era worldview and the Christian worldview in particular. Now, when we turn to Hebrews, we find both syllogistic and enthymematic reasoning. Even the first major block of Hebrews can be thought of in terms of a syllogism. The major premise perhaps being that the Son possesses greater honor than the angels in God's created order, in the ladder of creation, as it were. A specific premise, then, has to do with the message that God delivered through angels, namely the Torah, the Old Covenant. The message announced through the angels was enforced by God with punishments. One could think of an unstated transitional premise here, dishonoring the messenger, the Son in this case, the message of the gospel, by ignoring or making light of his message, will result in worse punishments than those inflicted on the Old Covenant, where the disobedient dishonored angels, the messengers of the Old Covenant. And we know what happened to them. Dishonoring that message resulted in their execution under the law, for example. Or when the nation as a whole abandoned the covenant, it resulted in conquest and exile of Israel and Judah. So God's reinforcement of that covenant teaches us to beware all the more of disregarding the covenant God has issued through the Son. This leads to then the conclusion, which is stated in 2:1 and 2. We should invest ourselves fully, without hesitation, without holding back anything, in the message announced through the Son, because the consequences of not doing so, of dishonoring the Son, would be so terrible. One can also note some less complete arguments, enthymemes, in Hebrews, really throughout the epistle, or the sermon. It's a very logic-rich text, like actually most of the epistles. But if we were to go to the other side of Hebrews, 12:28 to 29, we would find enthymemes at work. We read there, therefore, as we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude, through which let us continue serving in a manner well-pleasing to God, with reverence and fear, for indeed our God is a consuming fire. As we try to unpack the logic here, we could identify a major proposition. Let us show gratitude. This is a course of action that the author is urging the hearers to take, in contrast to the course of action that some are taking. Let us defect from this community and break faith with our divine patron, because it's costing too much to stay attached to it. So the proposition, let us show gratitude. The author gives a rationale. Since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude. So the rationale is we are being benefited by God. The unstated premise would be those who receive benefits owe gratitude. Therefore, we owe gratitude to God for what he is in the process of giving us. There is therefore this unstated premise. Recipients of great favors owe the giver a great debt of gratitude. And the idea of an unshakable kingdom certainly calls to mind an immense favor, therefore disposing the hearers to think of showing immense, costly gratitude. In the second part of this quote, we really in effect have a restatement of the proposition. Let us keep serving in a manner well-pleasing to God with reverence and fear. This describes what it means to show gratitude, through which let us do this. Another rationale is supplied, but only one rationale. For indeed, our God is a consuming fire. A verse taken out of, I believe, Deuteronomy. So it's kind of an appeal to an ancient authority at the same time. How does this rationale support the proposition? Well, there is an unstated premise that provides the connection between the two. Those who serve and please God are safe from the consequences of divine displeasure. God is a consuming fire. God is a threatening entity. But safety can be found by living in a manner pleasing to God. Therefore, This course of action is the only one that makes sense. Inductive proofs are those that do not proceed by such rigorous deduction, but rather invite the hearers to draw conclusions themselves based on other kinds of evidence. Technically, it's a much looser form of proof, but it can be nonetheless persuasive than deductive reasoning, all the more as the audience itself is involved in thinking with the speaker, to draw those conclusions and move in the direction in which the speaker is goading their minds anyway. A very important kind of inductive proof is the historical example. The premise being that what has devolved in a certain way in the past is likely to devolve in that way in the future as well. So, in Hebrews, consider Esau. Esau becomes an historical precedent that teaches us something about experience useful in the present moment. Esau showed disregard for the worth of what God had given him as the firstborn, and in making a bad choice, throwing it away, he was unable ever to get it back again. So this becomes a kind of a grid then. This historical example becomes a grid that is placed on the hearer's present experience. And they're invited to think, all right, if we make a move in our present circumstances that is comparable to the move Esau made, throwing away God's gifts for the sake of temporary relief, we will likely suffer the same consequences that Esau did, perpetual exclusion from the divine benefits. And so this example, this brief example, becomes a potentially potent proof in support of the author's proposition. Another kind of inductive proof is the proof from analogy, in which we move to another field of human experience to build a case for our statements concerning the immediate field of experience. So, agriculture is a very common place to go to for analogy. Agriculture is especially prominent as an analogy for education on the one hand, and also for the giving and receiving of benefits on the other, because one cultivates a field in the hope that that field will become itself productive in some way. This can therefore become a way to think about other realms of experience. We cultivate beneficiaries, clients, in the hope that they themselves will become productive of good. And one of those goods will be gratitude and loyalty toward those who have benefited them. So when the author of Hebrews moves in Hebrews 6, 7 to 8, away from thinking about those who have received all these gifts from God, and then hold Jesus up to public scorn by falling away, have no second chance at repentance. When he moves away from that discourse into talking about the ways in which fields respond to rain, he isn't digressing. He is moving to an analogy and inviting the hearers to consider the common experience of farming as a way of getting at support for the claim he's making about the experience of receiving God's benefits. The land that drinks in the rain that often falls upon it and bears vegetation that is suitable for those on whose behalf it has been cultivated, receives a blessing from God. So if after the analogy works this way. If after God has rained God's benefits upon us, if we become fruitful soil, productive of good for those on whose behalf God has been cultivating us, in this instance, chiefly, our fellow Christians whom we are called to support and bond together with and encourage and hold together with during this time of marginalization, then we have God's blessing. We have been a good field. We have been good clients. But if it produces thorns and thistles, it is good for nothing, and good for nothing except to be cursed and burned over. Now you can tell I don't have a Bible in front of me. I'm doing this from memory, and it's not that good. The point, though, being, if God's benefits produce something in us that is noxious to the giver and brings about nothing good for those on whose behalf God has been cultivating us, well, what kind of end should we expect? The same end as that field that won't bear forth a crop, but on which thorns and thistles keep running rampant, choking out the good seed. So, analogy can be a powerful inductive proof. It's not a rigorous proof. It's not based on any evidence of any kind, except the evidence of experience and common experience. And it rests on the willingness of the hearers to move between these different areas of experience and to make inferences from experience A pertinent to experience B, which is the one that's really at hand. Other kinds of inductive proofs are maxims and citations of ancient authorities. Maxims, proverbs, represent the distilled cultural wisdom gained from the observation of countless examples and the contemplation of analogies. A stitch in time saves nine is a proverb that has been distilled from the experience of tending to and mending garments over the centuries. And then it becomes a bit of cultural wisdom that can be applied analogously to any situation, not just the situation of perpetuating wardrobe's usefulness, but to tending to any problem quickly before it becomes a greater one. We find some maxims used in Hebrews. For example, Hebrews 12:11 is an expansion of the common, well-known saying in the ancient world, "The roots of education are bitter, but the fruits are sweet." And this works by providing assurance in the form of, well, we all know this is the way the world works. To bolster the author of Hebrews' case that what the hearers are presently experiencing, the unpleasant experiences of marginalization and abuse from their neighbors, is actually going to produce a wonderful crop for them later, just like the rigors of education, though difficult while enduring them, produce a wonderful crop for the future in a brilliant career. We might also find a maxim in Hebrews 9:27, "It is appointed to mortals to die once," which he then expands, to die once and then the judgment. But this saying has been found in other literature as well, and it might be that the author is drawing on, again, this cultural wisdom as part of bolstering his case about what's going to happen next in the Christian worldview. Mortals die once and then the judgment. Jesus died once to deal with sin, and then his return to judge, to reward, and to punish. Citations of ancient authority are far more common in Hebrews than maxims. They are inductive insofar as the audience is still being invited to make the connections themselves. They're also deductive to the extent that they often provide rationales or reinforce premises that are stated or unstated. We already saw an example of this in Hebrews 12:29, where a citation of ancient authority, which carries potentially inductive force is in fact applied in a deductive way as explicitly the rationale to a course of action.